I think your mom did better in the class than you did, but as I recall. Also enjoyed getting to have Rebecca in our internship last summer, although it had to be online, which was a weird way to do an internship, I know, but she's one of the few people that got through the enormous stack of materials that had to be read and sifted through and assimilated. In fact, I was telling the interns this summer, I've got three guys this summer, and I was just telling them earlier today that so far it's only been females that have gotten through the stack of materials in the intern program, and so they're fired up about trying to pull that off. And so I appreciate people like Rebecca that have encouraged that onward, even though they have no idea that they actually have had that kind of an effect. All right, the material that I'm presenting tonight is by and large in this book that I released in January. That is, we have available for purchase back there. And so in here, it gives a lot of this information and a lot of other things, but in a very abbreviated, diluted way, so to speak, is actually targeting really more like 7th through 10th graders is who I had in mind, and lots of great imagery and so forth to help you picture the things that are relevant to us with regard to the flood and the amazing, that great work of the Lord that the Lord worked on this planet roughly 4,500 years ago. And that's what we're going to look at a little bit more tonight in this kind of abbreviated session on that subject. So I want to cover in this session basically Genesis 6 through 9 and then the after effects of the event that is discussed there. So believe it or not, the geology world, at least among Christian nations, once accepted that the global flood of the Bible actually happened. And then about 175 years ago or so, uniformitarianism really took off in the world. And then it went to seed in the geology community. And so today, very few believe that the flood happened as described in the Bible. It's a theory for those kooky Bible believers who just blindly believe in the Bible, even if they don't even have any evidence. Even in spite of the evidence, they'll say. And so there's just no evidence for the biblical flood, they argue. And instead, the geological evidence supports evolution, they would say. Well, first of all, no Bible believer should have a blind faith. And the Bible never encourages a blind faith. We're to only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. In other words, you should only come to accept and believe what you can actually substantiate from the proof. That is a biblical way to view this. Look at, for example, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good, or test all things, the New King James says, hold fast that which is good. So the Bible encourages you to go examine the evidence before you come to accept something. 1 John 4:1, hey, you need to test the spirits. Many false prophets have gone out into the world. Acts 17:11, why were the Bereans more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica? Well, because they didn't just accept what they were told, they searched the Scriptures daily to make sure that what they were being told was right. They looked for evidence before they came to believe something. John 10:37, Jesus even told his audience not to believe him if he didn't substantiate the things he was teaching with evidence. In his case, it was through miraculous activity. So the Bible does not endorse you just blindly believing in God, blindly believing in the Bible. God wants you to examine the evidence. It will always force you to draw the conclusion that the Bible is true, that God exists, and therefore that you should model your life on what the Bible teaches you to do. So does the evidence actually support the biblical flood or not? The works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. You know, the things that God has done, His works, are something to study. They're worthy of our consideration, our pondering, because they tell us about God. And the flood was one of the greatest works that the Lord ever did. And the Bible tells us only a few details about this event. It occurred 4,000 to probably 5,000 years ago. It was global in its extent. So it covered everything. The fountains of the deep were broken up, and the water came from above. The windows of heaven were open. The mountains rose, the valleys sank, and it lasted essentially a year. And that's basically what you have to work with, and that's not really a lot. Now, when you look up from the pages of the Bible and then start looking at the physical evidence around us to try to get more information and study this great ancient work of the Lord, which is a key event in the history of mankind, that according to the Bible, we weren't supposed to forget. That's the reason that rainbow was put there. It had to do with making sure it's remembered what happened in that event. And so we start looking at the evidence around us and we try to figure out, how does this fit with what the Bible tells us happened, and is there actually evidence that supports what the Bible says happened? Okay, well, we have to reconcile the physical evidence in the universe around us with what we see in Scripture. And so we ask the question, did the flood happen? And if so, what further can we learn? What other things can we learn about what occurred in the flood? Does the evidence from geology fit with Scripture? Genesis 4:26, the very last verse of Genesis chapter 4, tells us that after Seth had Enosh, men began to call on the name of the Lord, which is a phrase, that call on the name of the Lord. You see that many times throughout Scripture. Chapter 5 then gives us the lineage of Seth and Enosh. These are generations of individuals who were then calling on the name of the Lord, by and large. But then things gradually changed over that time period, over the 1600 years or so after Seth is born. The reason for the flood, which is given in the text, is that every intent, every intention, the ESV says, of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. So that's the reason. Now, the cause of that wicked state on the earth is given in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6. The sons of God, which is an idiom referring to the good people who were calling on the name of the Lord, which were just discussed, right, previous to chapter 6, they begin to notice beauty, physical beauty, and give priority to that in their marital decisions. So the good people began marrying the daughters of men, the worldly people, based on physical beauty rather than spiritual beauty. And young people, let that be a warning about the qualities that you prioritize in your dating and marriage decisions. Ultimately, beauty is totally irrelevant in light of eternity. Proverbs 31:30, charm is deceitful, beauty is passing. A woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Well, God instructs Noah to build a boat 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, and according to scholars, that would translate to a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, assuming an 18-inch cubit. When in actuality, a cubit is probably closer to 20 or 21 inches. There's different kinds of cubits, and the one that was probably being used is a little bit longer than 18 inches, but assuming an 18-inch cubit, then we're looking at a football field and a half long. And he's told to make the ark out of this unknown wood called gopher wood, put 3 levels in this structure, and make rooms, little cubicles for the animals, cover this with pitch and so that it doesn't leak, and then put a door in the side of it. He tells Noah to install an opening. This is not exactly a window like we think about in our Bible classes as kids, but according to the underlying Hebrew, it suggests an opening for light and probably ventilation that apparently went around the top of this vessel and was a cubit in height. According to Genesis 8:13, a covering or an awning of some sort is put over this opening, which was then left there until the end of the torrential rains, and then Noah opens this window-like structure to see the state of things at that point. All right, God apparently brought or sent the animals that he wanted on the ark. He sent them to Noah. Notice that Noah doesn't have to go hunt these down. Instead, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So a male and female representative of the unclean kinds of animals, and according to chapter 7, 7 representatives of the clean kinds of animals. This is probably 7 individuals, not 7 pairs. And again, these are representatives of kinds, not species. Now, animals from the earth, including birds and creeping things, the text says, which would have included various reptiles and some insects, for example. Noah also brings food for his family and the animals. It's definitely any of the animals that were not in a hibernative state during this period of time. And then after loading up, God himself shuts the door, and then the fireworks begin, and that, of course, brings us right up to the actual flood. So some have argued, well, the flood just couldn't have been global. There's just not enough water on the earth, they say, to have a global flood. And so they look at the earth today and they say, well, if the flood happened, where did all the water, where's all the water from this major event that would have been required to cover the entire planet? Where did it go? Is it in the sky? There's not enough water in the sky to do that. And you actually only have about one. If you were to dump all the water from the clouds down, you only got about an inch worth of water. Is it frozen in the ice caps? No, that won't do it either. If you were to melt the ice caps, we estimate that it's going to be about 230 feet of depth that will be added to our oceans. Is it within the crust? That is a little more significant. There is an estimated 6 quintillion gallons of water in the Earth's crust today. Now, if all that water is pumped back onto the surface of the Earth, and that would be enough to cover the Earth with water 600 feet high, so we're talking 2 football fields into the sky, and that's just the water hidden in the crust. But notice, all this is still pretty insignificant because you total all this up, we're still at less than 1,000 feet, and then you consider the great mountains today, many of which are 25,000 feet in height. And so many of those who consider numbers like these and still want to believe in the Bible will often reject a worldwide flood and argue, well, the flood had to have been a local catastrophe and everything's just being told from the perspective of Noah. This is not some global event. But as we'll see, that argument simply can't be sustained in light of science or Scripture, and the evidence points to a global catastrophe. And so let's study that now for a few moments. I want to start with the depiction of the flood, what modern creation scientists believe occurred during the first few hours of the flood. All right, so as I mentioned, I might not have actually mentioned this, can't remember, but modern creation science thinking is that much of the water in the flood came from your oceans and from below the earth rather than above, which was once the thinking. And keep in mind, it's also incorrect to think of the flood as only involving water. The flood is a major geologic event. The earth is restructured. The phrase, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, is a significant phrase. So the great deep referring to the depths of the ocean. So we're talking about the breakup of the ocean floor. Proverbs 3:20 mentions that as well, stating that the depths were broken up. So the flood is a major geologic event, and notice that the text says here that all of the fountains of the great deep are broken up. There's more than just one. Again, this suggests the breakup of the ocean floor itself, probably the beginning of plate tectonics. Now, the order of events given in Genesis 7 is noteworthy to creation scientists today. The fountains of the great deep are broken up, and then the rain is mentioned second. So what exactly initiates this chain of events is unclear. Did God miraculously, directly initiate the eruption of the fountains of the great deep? Or did he use some kind of external physical entity that comes and affects the earth like a massive meteorite or multiple meteorites? There is a substantial amount of evidence that suggests that a lot of meteorites struck during what we understand to be the flood period that we see in the geologic column. And so secular geologists tell us that there are roughly 200 acknowledged meteorite craters on the earth that have been verified as being, without a doubt, from meteorites. And when you convert the dates that they give for those craters to the biblical time frame, you find that 57% of the confirmed meteorite impacts throughout Earth's history struck during the single year of the flood. 57% of all the meteorite craters in the flood. Another 23% of the confirmed meteorite impacts date to the period immediately following the flood, from the flood through what we would say is the Ice Age, up to Abraham. So 80% of all the known meteorite impacts occurred during the flood and then during the following few centuries as the earth was ultimately calming down. So regardless of how it all began, creation geologists have tried to piece together what may have occurred after the point when the flood begins, based on what we understand about geology today. So geologists have determined that when you look at the interior of the earth, it is comprised of a solid inner core and then a liquid outer core and then a mantle predominantly of solid rock, although the upper part has some plasticity. And then you have the crust above that upon which we live. Now, looking at the surface, geologists have discovered that the surface of the earth is broken into these enormous, what we call plates, big chunks of rock that then move around today on the order of centimeters per year, basically as fast as your fingernails grow. And the earth appears to be, so it's kind of like a big cracked egg, and the earth is apparently unique in that. The earth is the only known planet to have these plates as far as has been discovered so far. So creation geologists believe that the cracking of that egg may have been right there at the initiation of the flood when all the fountains of the great deep break open. And recent articles by various secular geologists suggest that plate tectonics may have been initiated by meteorite activity, which would fit with what we're saying here. So the model that describes the motion of the plates today and the effects of that motion is called plate tectonics, and students learn about this in earth science and in geology. Most geologic activity on the earth occurs along the margins of these big plates as they move. So earthquakes, volcanoes, mountain building, all of that is occurring at the margins of these big tectonic plates. So as they move relative to each other, we find different things happening. Some transform, where they slide past one another as they're moving. Some diverge, so they move apart, and then new material from the mantle comes up into the gap. And again, that's called divergence. And so you'll see at seafloor spreading, you'll see the ridges, the mid-ocean ridges forming as divergence occurs, and you'll see mountains forming when you have divergence on continents. And so you have some that will converge. That's where you have two plates moving into each other, smashing into each other, forming mountains, or one diving into the mantle below the other one. And so mountains and volcanoes form as that kind of movement occurs. Now, mountain building is extremely slow today because the plates are moving as fast as your fingernails are moving. So at today's rates, it would take eons to form those mountains. And so if mountain building is happening today at such slow rates, then how can creationists explain that evidence? How can that be harmonized with Scripture? especially when we see that the formation of the mountains lines up with the flood layers. These are the rock layers that the flood is occurring in, according to creation scientists' thinking. And so these are being formed in the flood. How do we explain that? Well, let's think about plate tectonics and the movement of these plates that comprise the surface of the earth. So from the movement of these plates, how we see them moving apart today, for example, the places where there's divergence going on, they can extrapolate backwards and get an idea of where these plates were in the past. And so you probably heard about the supercontinent Pangaea, or the supercontinent thought to have preceded Pangaea, what creationists call Rodinia. So plate tectonic theory is able to explain why, when you reverse the trajectory of the continents moving around, why they fit together like this big puzzle. Whenever you change the trajectory of the continents, they fit together. Like you see South America and Africa fitting together very nicely today. So this Pangaea idea, it explains why not only do the continents fit together like a big puzzle, but when you put this back together, there's matching rock layers that then go across these pieces. And there's mountain belts that continue moving, like the Appalachians move over and become the Caledonian Mountains in Europe. And so they all fit together like that, and they're now separated by oceans. But when you put this back together, we have matching mountain belts. You have matching fossil distributions across these puzzle pieces that again are now separated, but when you put this together, the fossils line up there, and many other things. So plate tectonics has great explanatory power. It's a powerful theory. But as usual, modern naturalistic theories are based on terrible assumptions. In this case, uniformitarianism, which is the theory that underlies every single evolutionary dating technique I've ever seen. And it's the idea that whatever we see going on today in geology, it must have always gone on in that same way. So if today we see things moving on the order of centimeters per year, okay, well the continents must have always moved that slowly throughout time, and therefore it's going to take a long time to get the continents where they are today. And it must have taken forever for them to fit together into this, and it must have taken forever for these mountains to form. Well, we can know that the Bible is inspired, and we'll talk about during the invitation how we can know that. And so we can know that the Bible is inspired, and the Bible speaks of the flood, which means uniformitarianism is not right. You cannot, things going on today are not necessarily what they've always been throughout time. So you have to keep in mind the possibility of events that could have happened in the past which don't occur today. So using the actual evidence from modern geology and plate tectonics, but without the hidden assumption of uniformitarianism, and instead allowing for a global catastrophe like the flood, creation geologists have developed our own theory called catastrophic plate tectonics, rather than just plate tectonics. Well, the young Earth creation geophysicist by the name of John Baumgartner laid the groundwork for this model back in the 90s when he developed a supercomputer program while he was at UCLA doing his doctoral research in geophysics and space physics. The program he developed, called Terra, helps to model what's going on as the plates are moving on the Earth's interior. And so based upon the predictions of his program, other creation physicists and geologists joined him in developing what is called catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT, that describes what likely occurred during the flood. So significantly paraphrasing this model, before the flood, the plates didn't exist, the continents were not separated at that point, and then at the onset of the flood, all the fountains of the great deep are broken up, Genesis 7:11, the plates break apart and start moving. And so understand that the fountains of the deep there wouldn't even just be necessarily solely water, but could be fountains of magma from beneath the earth being referred to as well. So according to catastrophic plate tectonics, something causes the breakup of the ocean floor. The cold, dense ocean floor breaks it in several places, including the breaking of the ocean plates away from the continental plates. And according to computer simulations, when the break at those boundaries between your continental plates and your oceanic plates, when that happens, there would have been what is called thermal runaway subduction of the sea floor. So basically, instead of the slow rates that the plates are moving into the mantle today, at the beginning of the flood, the sea floor is diving into the mantle. It's in a runaway fashion, very rapidly. Well, in 1994, when this was being developed, creation scientists said, okay, if that is true, if that happened, what we're predicting to be the case, then the mantle would have essentially been overturned like a conveyor belt. The material would have replaced the entire ocean floor. Well, if that's the case, there should be enormous piles of colder material down at the base of the mantle, like piled up on the core. Because this just happened, 4,500 years ago. See, if uniformitarian plate tectonics is true, then the slow process we see today has always gone on. So before the ocean floor gets that far into the mantle, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to start recycling into the mantle, and you're not going to find enormous piles of colder stuff down deep in the mantle. It should have had time to recycle into the mantle. But not if this occurred rapidly just a few thousand years ago. There should be enormous piles of cold ocean floor in the mantle if the creation perspective is true. Well, sure enough, 3 years after creation has made this prediction, technology finally got to the point where we could look at the actual interior of the mantle's density structure, and it verified creationist predictions and showed that there's enormous piles of cooler slabs of material in the mantle under the subduction zones piled up down at the core, which is apparently remnants of the pre-flood ocean crust that just rapidly dove down there and piled up in the core, on the core. And so this rapid diving is now causing the plates to move around quickly on the surface of the earth on the order of meters per second. It's not continental drift, it's continental sprint. The plates are moving quickly. So the supercontinent breaks up, starts moving apart rapidly. This would have caused the rapid formation of all the mountains along your subduction zones and your convergent zones as the materials are piling up, as the plates are diving or slamming into each other, forming these mountains. So you picture a conveyor belt with the cold crust of the ocean diving into the mantle. Hot mantle material then comes up to fill the space in these divergent zones. So hot material comes up to the ocean floor. What's going to happen? What happens when you throw water on let's say you've got a fire going, you're camping or something, you throw water on your campfire, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to see steam. So this hot extra magma hits the cold ocean floor. It would have caused steam jets to jettison into the atmosphere. This would have been, this magma is coming up along all the divergent zones of the earth, most of which are in the oceans. And this would have caused intense rain around the globe as these geysers that stretch for hundreds of miles all over the earth are erupting all simultaneously, pumping water high up into the atmosphere, which then comes back down from the heavens onto the land. Okay, so now you have added magma that is now replacing the ocean floor as it dives into the mantle. You've got fresh magma that is now displacing the water from the seas, pushing that onto the land. So that hot material is now replacing the colder moving material on the ocean floor. That hot material, because it's hotter, it's going to be less dense and it's going to be lighter because it's so hot. So essentially the ocean floor is going to be floating higher in the mantle, which pushes the sea floor up. They estimate 3,500 feet or more. And so as the sea floor is then being raised, as the sea floor is being replaced, the sea floor is being raised. So water from the seas is now is spilling onto the land, carrying with it sea creatures being pushed onto the land, as well as lots of sediment, lots of dirt and mud and clay and so forth. So this explains why you've got so many marine creatures all over the planet, even on areas that are now in the center of continents and even up on mountains. So water is coming in from the ocean as the sea level is rising. In addition to the water coming down from these immense geysers, you've got tsunamis that are smashing into the coasts due to all the major tectonic activity going on under the ocean. So most of the water from the flood is actually coming from the ocean. through this process. Well, while all of that's going on, remember, you have to keep in mind the meteorite impacts that are occurring. And so far, there are over 100 meteorite craters that have been found on land that correlate to the flood period. But 70% of the surface of the earth is actually the ocean. And so if you take what we know about the land and extrapolate to the ocean areas, we have to add another 230 meteorite impacts that are occurring during the flood. So we're thinking well over 300 meteorites in all are smashing into the earth during the year of the flood. And so clearly meteorites are a significant part of what is going on. All right, so let's look now at Psalm 104. You covered the earth with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Well, in light of verse 9 there, it seems clear that this passage is surely referring to the flood, not creation week. Otherwise, this passage was violated when the flood then occurred. So assuming this is talking about the flood, which fits, then the modern creation model, this catastrophic plate tectonics, says that the high mountains are formed during the flood, just like this passage is indicating, because all the plates are smashing into each other at these convergence and subduction zones. So now, due to the formation of the mountains in the flood, it is now impossible for there to be enough water to completely submerge the earth again, just like this passage indicates. So by the mountains rising and the valley sinking, verse 8, a boundary was set for the water that it might not again cover the earth. That may be exactly what's going on there. Well, according to the text, the rain itself continues for 40 uninterrupted days and nights, but that's not the extent of the catastrophe. The waters apparently continued to rise for some time after that. According to catastrophic plate tectonics, that would be due to the fountains of the deep continuing to disperse lava and possibly more water from beneath the earth, displacing the seas onto the land. So the rising waters then eventually level out and apparently then begin to decrease about 5 months into the flood, on the 150th day from the beginning of the flood. So the water is then 15 cubits above the mountains, at least by that point in the floods. Notice that during this catastrophic period, typical earth processes, so seasons, day and night even, and others are totally disrupted. After the flood, God promises in Genesis 8:22, He's not going to allow that to occur again on a global scale. And so the disruption of the seasons as well as the disruption of day and night, again, would be expected from this catastrophic plate tectonics model. So the cloud cover from both water and from all the aerosols from all the volcanic activity going on would have essentially stopped day and night, blocked out sunlight, and with it summer and much of the heat that we receive. Obviously, seed time and harvest would be disrupted while the earth was covered with water. So let's return to the question we asked at the beginning. How could the flood be global? How could there even be enough water to cover the earth, prevailing above the mountains over 20 feet? Well, with the CPT model I've already laid out, you might already see the answer to that question. Let's look at the science first. Remember that CPT would say that the water came primarily from the seas, both in the form of rain from these enormous geysers and then in the form of the sea level being raised from more magma and hotter ocean floors. So when you then recall from Psalm 104 that the taller mountains are forming during the flood, and you recall from CPT that the mountains are forming as the plates are converging and subducting, well, that implies that the pre-flood world would have been much flatter. And so notice it wouldn't have been nearly as hard to cover the land at that point, because the taller mountains aren't even forming until later in the flood during the recession period. They finally get high enough where now they start sticking up out of the water after the flood has already covered the entire land. So you picture a flatter earth, one with a lower elevation, covering the highest points on the earth by day 40, wouldn't require anywhere near the amount of water that it would require today. So where did all the water go after the flood? Well, first of all, as the ocean floor is raised during the flood, remember that you got this, this conveyor belt activity going on, and then you've got this intense geyser activity going on, and in causing from the fountains of the deep. That activity would have dumped loads of sediment onto the continent, which would have raised the level of the continents relative to pre-flood times. And now you also have mountains that are then forming at these convergence and subducting plate boundaries, which then raises the land in those areas even further. So notice that without the water going anywhere, the continents are now higher in elevation, and they're going to stick up out of the water further than they would have during the pre-flood times. But then you add to that other implications of CPT. So recall that as the ocean floor is diving into the mantle, new material is coming up and replacing that at all these divergent zones. That material, remember, is hotter, which means it's less dense, which means it's going to sit higher in the mantle. That would have raised the ocean floor, remember, about 3,500 feet or more. So then that conveyor belt process would have then gradually slowed, and therefore the steam jets would have stopped. And then as that new material on the ocean floor started cooling, okay, it's now going to become more dense again, and it's going to start sitting lower in the mantle, effectively lowering the seafloor again to the pre-flood level, which would have then allowed much of the water covering the land to recede back to the ocean floor from where it came. And then you also, of course, have all of these major recesses that are formed at all these subduction zones as well. So bottom line, no problem from science in explaining where the water came from for a global flood or where it went afterward. And then you got other evidences of a global flood from science, starting at what we call the Cambrian explosion. This is to all intents and purposes the beginning of the fossil record, down at the base of what we call your Paleozoic rock layers. That's the point creationists believe the flood started. Starting at that point, you have worldwide sandstone beds that were laid down by some kind of catastrophic worldwide event involving a lot of water. How in the world are you going to explain that if not from a flood? These aren't localized beds of sediment like you see up in the higher layers of the geologic column like today. This is after, of course, when we believe the flood happened. No, down at that point, you have these worldwide sandstone beds. They begin at the Cambrian explosion, and then you see these similar worldwide beds continuing on up in the geologic column to the point at which the flood is thought by many to end, just above what we call the Mesozoic rock layers. You also have sedimentary rock as the dominant rock type throughout all these worldwide layers. And sedimentary rock is rock that is generally agreed to be rock formed from water activity, exactly what we'd predict if the flood happened and if it was global. So when we now move from science and we start looking at the Bible, we see that the Bible also doesn't leave room for a local flood interpretation. So very quickly, if it was a local flood, why in the world do you even build an ark over decades of time? Why not just leave the area if this is going to be local? Why bring animals from all over if this is going to be local, where you've got representatives of every living thing of all flesh? Why do that if it's local? Since God actually sent the animals to Noah anyway, why not just send them out of the area instead? How would the ark even be able to stay afloat for several months if this is just a local flood? How could the biblical terminology that describes the water as covering the high mountains that are under the whole heaven, how could that be describing a local flood? How could water even get high enough locally to cover a mountain that if the flood wasn't in fact greater in its extent? How could the biblically stated purpose of wiping man from the face of the whole earth, how could that be accomplished with a local flood? If the flood was local, then isn't it true that God lied when He promised never to destroy the earth again with a flood in the way that He did? Now, local floods happen all the time, so God would have had to have lied if that's the case. But not global floods. Those don't happen. And God said those won't happen anymore. Also, Peter used the universal destruction of the earth in the flood to describe what Judgment Day is going to be like. So if the flood wasn't universal, then logically, judgment won't be either. Also, why would the seasons have been affected if this is just a local flood? Again, seed time, harvest, winter, summer, day and night, are all disrupted during the flood. Doesn't sound like the effects of a local flood. And then why is it that the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot when that dove was sent out? And so the Bible simply doesn't leave room for a local flood interpretation. Either the Bible is right that there was a global flood, or the Bible is wrong about that. And there's no reason to question the Bible's claim that there was a global flood scientifically. All right, so on the same day that the waters began to decrease, the text says that the ark rested in the mountains of Ararat, and the waters continued to recede for another 4 months. And during that period of recession, we know that the retreating waters would have catastrophically eroded many of Earth's canyons today, though not all of them. Grand Canyon is thought to have been later. Then after 9 months, on the first day of the 10th month, Noah could see the tops of various mountains. And then after another 40 days, he sends out a raven and a dove. And he then waits another week and sends a dove out again. And then it returns. He waits another week, sends the dove out again. The dove doesn't return. He waits about another month, removes the covering from the ark, sees that the surface of the earth is dry. He waits another almost 2 months until the earth is completely dry, and they finally leave the ark. So the timeline as given in the text is understood to be based on the Jewish calendar, which reckons time based on a lunar year, which is 354 days total. So based on the text, a year and 11 days passed according to the lunar year. When you convert that to the solar calendar, we find that from beginning to end, Noah and the other passengers left the ark after 1 solar year, so exactly 365 days. So Noah and his family, 8 people, exit the ark, and from those 8 people repopulate the entire earth. So genetically, we have a portion of Noah and a portion of his wife in our blood, regardless of our ethnicity. Now, whether or not the wives of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were actually part of Noah's family is uncertain. Did they marry sisters or cousins? Then that affects how much of our genes actually are traced back directly to only Noah and his wife. Peter says that the world that then existed, though, perished and from what occurred here, and there is no doubt a lot more meaning from that than we typically ascribe to it. So the passengers from the ark exit, and they find a completely different earth from the one they experienced before the flood. This chart gives the lifespans of the patriarchs as recorded in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. And notice the approximate 900-year lifespan before the flood, with the exception of Enoch and Lamech. And then you notice this gradual drop in lifespans after the flood. And Genesis 11, is the genealogies that pick up after the flood. They're not quite, the terminology is a little bit different there. It's not quite as clear-cut as Genesis 5, but this seems to provide some evidence for the fact that apparently something is significantly different about the earth due to what occurred in the flood. Things are changing quickly, and there's probably some major environmental change that has happened that is affecting life longevity as well as species across the planet. Size, health, life longevity drop drastically, possibly in a proportional way to what's going on the earth as it gradually calms down after the flood. And as further evidence of the major change that apparently occurred, Genesis 9 verses 2 and 3 says that animals would begin to fear and dread humans now. This is possibly indicating something different about the nature of animals as well, maybe again due to an environmental change here. And then in verse 3 of chapter 9, apparently linked with that statement about the animals, you have the first mention of God authorizing a carnivorous diet for humans, which you would think would probably lead to animals beginning to fear humans. Now, whether or not some humans were already eating meat before this is unclear, but for sure God authorizes it at this point. And it's also unclear as to whether this is the point at which animals formally became carnivorous. This isn't necessarily demanded by the text. There's evidence in the flood layers of animals eating other animals. So we have evidence of carnivory during the flood going on at least. Another example of how different the world was after the flood is what we call the Ice Age. We find a lot of evidence on the earth that a large portion of the earth was once covered with ice. In fact, 30% of the land is thought to have been covered with ice at one point, as opposed to today, where it's about 10%. And so we can look at glacier movement today and see what happens when glaciers move. We can see their effects. And from those observations, we can tell that the glaciers of the north used to extend down deep into the northern hemisphere. You see what are called parallel striations, parallel scratches on rocks that will extend over miles and miles of terrains from rocks and boulders that are holed up in glaciers that are scratching the rocks under these glaciers as these glaciers move. You find faceted rocks where they're just worn flat from glacier movement as they move over them. You find till and moraines that pile up, for example, on the edges of glaciers as they move. So secular geologists today argue there was multiple ice ages over the last few million years, as many as 50 different ice ages, they'll say. But there's lots of issues with the modern interpretation of the evidence for the ice ages. And no single theory has been able to explain the physical evidence among the secular models. So why, for example, is it the case that all of the animal extinctions occur only after the last ice age, where you have 167 entire genera of the large mammals completely disappear from the earth? Why do you have all of the what are called disharmonious associations, where you have your warm area animals like hippos that are mixing with your cold area animals like your woolly mammoths and reindeers? You find them in the fossil record all jumbled up together. Why do you have evidence of wet deserts? Desert areas that are now desert, but you find out evidence from the past that they used to be wet and lush. And of course, the biggest issue from the uniformitarian evolutionary mindset is there is no known mechanism to even begin a single ice age, much less as many as 50, which is what they're believing in. So how do you even get one started from a secular perspective? Well, this is a place where, once again, creation science, if you let the evidence speak and you let the Bible have a voice, creation science provides a solid answer to the problems of uniformitarian thinking with regard to the ice ages. In fact, an ice age would be predicted to follow the flood based on CPT, as the CPT model I've already laid out for you. An ice age would have been a necessary effect of catastrophic plate tectonics. So modern creation science theorizes there weren't multiple ice ages. There was a single ice age, and it's more of like an ice advance rather than an ice age, because this is just a short period of time where there's a gradual buildup. It only lasted about 700 years, with a peak at about the 500-year mark after the flood. So creation scientists would say all of the evidence that secular meteorologists are using to argue for ice ages over millions of years, it all fits into a single major ice age that lasted only a few hundred years. All right, so what would be needed to initiate an ice age? Well, you might be tempted to think, okay, well, you need colder winters, okay? You need more colder winters so you can have more snow. Well, that actually would have an opposite effect, because with more cold comes more dryness. You have less moisture. And that gets at the root of why secular meteorologists can't figure out a good way to even get one of these ice ages started. So you need three basic things. You need cooler summers, you need more moisture, and then you need a persistence of those characteristics. And all three of these would have been effects of the flood. So let's think through that. So according to catastrophic plate tectonics, you got a lot of volcanic activity going on during the flood as these continents are moving around very rapidly. That would shoot lots of ash and aerosols into the atmosphere. That's going to block solar radiation, which is going to cool your summers. So the first characteristic you need. That would have caused less melting during the summertime. So today, the ice caps will grow in the winter, and then they melt even more during the summer. And so they're retreating. So you got to have the opposite occurring in order for an ice age to happen. So if you cool your summers, there's going to be less melting. So in the winter, they're able to advance annually. And then notice towards the end of a single period of that, you're going to expect more extinctions to happen. because now the ice is threatening the habitats and making it where the animals aren't being able to find places to be able to survive, because more and more of the land is being covered up. Also, the pre-flood environment is likely warmer, including the ocean, but now you've got all this volcanic activity going on during and after the flood that is heating the ocean up even more, several more degrees. So what's going to happen if you got warmer oceans? More evaporation, much more evaporation of the seawater. What's that going to lead to? Well, it's going to lead to way more snow, especially away from the equator, and since you have sun rays halted by the aerosols and ash. All right, so you've got more evaporation and you've got cooler summers. The third ingredient we need is persistence of those. Well, we'd predict that all of this volcanic activity is going on for some time after the flood, so the oceans would have continued providing significantly elevated evaporation for possibly centuries until the earth finally calms down and things move back towards an equilibrium state, at which time the ice would have begun to retreat, as it is continuing to retreat really today. We're basically still recuperating from the post-flood ice age. Towards the end of that period, you expect catastrophic melting with huge amounts of water that are forming lakes, even in deserts. And again, that explains now your wet deserts. So as the lakes grew from that melting, many of those natural dams that are holding the water in some of these makeshift lakes would breach, causing the rapid formation of canyons, which is a phenomenon observed to occur even today when these kind of dams breach. The Lake Missoula flood is known to have occurred due to the failure of a natural dam in actually an ice age. Secular ethnologists acknowledge that, and it caused immense destruction, including a 50-mile long trench that is between 1 and 6 miles wide, with walls up to 900 feet high, carved out of solid rock. Geologists estimate that 10 cubic miles of basalt from that trench was eroded rapidly by catastrophic flooding from the Lake Missoula dam breach. Grand Canyon is believed by many Christian scientists to have been formed in that manner during the Ice Age period as well. Whenever you've got breaching of some of these makeshift lakes that could have domino effect, basically breached and rapidly carved the Grand Canyon. I was able to go by raft into the Grand Canyon and study some of that evidence with a creation geologist several years ago. All right, so the creationist ice advance theory may or may not be true. Again, it is a theory. It has great explanatory power, though, where modern uniformitarian models fail to explain the evidence. It explains the huge number of animal extinctions, why they only occurred once. Well, it's because there's just a single ice age. It explains the disharmonious associations of the animals, because mild winters, cooler summers keeps all the animals relatively mixed. The evidence for the wet deserts is explained. Post-flood evaporation and rain and glacier melting would have affected that. Animal dispersions from Asia up to America and across the Bering Strait is explained because you got more water in the form of ice and clouds allowing access across the strait, and plus ice bridges would have been forming in various places. The rapid formation of the post-flood canyons is explained. The thickness of the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica is explained. And of course, the biggest plus is that we have a clear-cut trigger to initiate the ice advance, which gives the flood some major explanatory power in explaining the physical evidence. All right, we're starting to wrap this up down to the last couple minutes here. While this is going on, you keep in mind, humanity is now reproducing after the flood. Genesis 10:11 gives genealogical information about these intervening centuries during what creation scientists theorize to be the ice advance. And Genesis 10:11 helps us to see which line from Noah went and repopulated which areas of the world, but not much beyond that is known. Babel falls in that period. It could have been as early as 100 years after the flood or a few decades later, and this would fall during the period of the Ice Age, according to CPT, which might help explain humanity's reluctance to obey God and spread out beyond the Middle East area, and might explain why God chose to step in when he did, to make sure that the spread occurred before the conditions of the Ice Age prevented passage to some of the remote areas. So regardless, we know that the earth, between the flood and Tower of Babel, has just one language during that time period, and then the language divisions are officially created for the first time, and the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth spread out from Palestine. Archaeologists divide what they call early human history into 3 ages. It's really not early human history. This is really just the evidence of humans shows up in the rock layers after the flood. So early human history would be pre-flood, and there is no human fossil remains from that period. This is all after the flood. So this is the period when the flood ends, and all of the archaeological evidence we then have is showing what occurred after the flood with humans. They divide that period, which they call early human history, into the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And the Stone Age would correlate to what we would call post-flood, pre-Abraham. The Bronze Age from Abraham to David, and then the Iron Age really from David to arguably today, depending upon who you talk to about that. So we would correlate the Stone Age with the post-flood period, especially the period of the dispersion after Babel. So archaeologists look at the artifacts that have been dug up there in that period, and they see that evidence were nomadic during that time. They're called hunter-gatherers. They're moving from place to place, and they believe they were doing that for a long period of time until humans evolved to the point where we could begin settling and farming. And we would interpret the evidence very differently. They were primarily nomadic for a brief period of time because they're spreading out and filling the earth after Babel, and so they're nomads. They're following the herds of animals, for example. So it has nothing to do with human intelligence. It has to do with humans spreading out, repopulating the earth after Babel, because God is forcing that to occur. Okay, so then after, and by the way, cavemen are generally associated with your Stone Age or Paleolithic period, and that is likely because humans are stopping in caves, for example, to stay for periods of time before moving on to the next place as they are dispersing. Again, it has nothing to do with unintelligence. After a few hundred years, they spread out and begin to settle, and so you see different archaeological artifacts surfacing, and that would be expected from a more farming culture that is now staying put in one area, what is called the Bronze Age. And it's during that time you find evidence of writing. And so it's not that humans couldn't have written before that, but they were definitely intellectually capable of it, but there just may not have been as much of a need for it. It's interesting that you didn't even see writing whenever the Europeans came over and discovered the New World area. You didn't find evidence of writing from many of the Native American tribes that were here. And so that has nothing to do with intelligence. It has more to do with the nature of the culture and what they're involved in doing and so forth. We have to keep in mind that even though God created multiple languages at Babel, it doesn't say anything about the written languages. It could be that humans had to develop those on their own. And then finally, you ultimately have your Iron Age. All right, so as we wrap up, once again, let's think about the flood. Jesus called the attention of his audience back to the flood, you remember in Matthew 24. As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, till the day that Noah entered the ark and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. You know, is it important to study the works of the Lord like the flood? Well, apparently so. I mean, this is referred to here even by Jesus. This is crucial that humanity doesn't forget the significance of this event. The flood is a physical depiction of what God thinks about sin. Have you thought about that? You know, we look at the beautiful mountains around us. We have this God that loves us and gives us these pretty mountains to go look at. Not whenever you understand what probably formed these mountains. It is a terribly violent thing that's going on. The more I study the science of the flood, the more in awe I am of what God thinks about sin. We serve a holy God that expects us to get our lives right if we want to please Him. The flood is a reminder of the judgment that can always be right around the corner when you least expect it if you don't get your life right. But thankfully, it's also a reminder that those who, like Noah, choose to obey God can receive the grace of God and be saved through water. and receive the benefits of God's grace. Once the divine suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water, there's also an antitype